First, I'm delighted to say Mal Fletcher, a futurist, joins me now to talk all things AI and warfare. Mal, just before we get into the very real issues that we have with AI and warfare, this situation, the signal situation in the United States of America, this really is the concern for me, that you've got people who totally believe that these systems are safe, or they don't care, or they're so used to having these conversations on their mobile phones that they're not thinking about top level security. Do you think we're going to see more of this rather than less of it?
Hi, Petrie. It's good to be with you again. Yeah, I do think we'll see more of it because we're so complacent, really, about these sorts of systems. We're so used to having them, as you say, in our lives, and we just trust them a little bit too much. We trust also that those who build them have benevolent motives or altruistic motives, and they don't necessarily. So even if this information hadn't come out in the public square through the Atlantic magazine, it could have been used by one of the big tech companies behind Signal for nefarious purposes, could have been sold to a foreign government. So it just goes to show that it's not just everyday people like us that are complacent about these things, it's people in high places too.
Yeah, it's absolutely mind-blowing to me. But look, let's turn to weaponry. Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Gaza, both theatres of war at the moment, and they are using and developing AI weaponry. And this is the way it's going to go, isn't it? That there's going to be more and more machinery that, as you and I have discussed before, does not have a moral compass.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, it's really the first time that the line between traditional weapons that rely on human operators and fully autonomous AI weapons has been crossed in Russia, Ukraine and Gaza, Israel, as you mentioned. We know that Russia uses AI-powered anti-jamming drones to counter Ukraine's AI-directed drones. And Israel relies on AI to help identify areas that house the most Hamas militants. So to a limited extent, AI systems are already making life and death decisions, and it's an area where we're going to see a lot of development in the next few years. A lot more governments taking up what we call loitering weapons that hover over an area until the target's been identified by AI, and then they attack. We're going to see a lot more missile defense systems like Israel's Iron Dome. We'll see more what we call cyber physical hybrids that can both hack into an enemy system and carry out physical attacks at the same time. So there's so much ahead of us and so little discussion as yet on the morality and ethical questions that all of this raises.
To what degree will human beings be behind these weapons?
Well, I mean, human beings don't need to be involved in the actual decision-making once the thing is deployed in some cases.
Wow.
Fully autonomous weapons, by definition, don't need our input, but we have to train them. And that raises questions of things like bias. There's great questions at the moment about the targeting of certain populations when we know that AI does carry bias, the bias of its training. There's a report recently that suggested that AI-based targeting systems have at least a 10% error rate, which can lead to the bombing of residential buildings, schools and hospitals. So, you know, and of course
10% error. Wow.
10%. Yes, 10%. That's frightening, isn't it?
I mean, it's horrifying that and to some degree, that appears to be acceptable. That you know, that they go, well, 10%, that's okay, you know, at least 90% of the time we're right. I mean, how is that even acceptable?
Well, I don't think it is. And I think the other question is, what does AI autonomy do to our sense of human values? AI distances the operator from the human impact of their actions. So AI might make us more efficient on the battlefield, but not necessarily more humane. It reduces warfare to a kind of mathematical exercise. And out of all of that, we might end up with a Cold War style standoff, but with tools that are much more difficult to control, tools that we don't really always understand anyway. And that's especially true as AI becomes available to rogue states or non-state actors like Hamas or the Houthis that we hear so much about.
a lot of people will be listening to this go great, because that means that soldiers won't be being killed, right? These are just machines attacking machines, or machines attacking whoever decides who's the bad guy, and for me that's the worry. But you know, but soldiers won't have to be killed, and that is a good thing. You know, that's what people will be thinking.
Yeah, and there's some truth in that, but there are other important humanitarian considerations too with autonomous AI weapons. In Ukraine and Gaza, for example, we've got entire generations now facing long-lasting emotional and mental scars, with thousands or perhaps millions of orphaned children and broken institutions, all because of partly AI-influenced weaponry. AI's efficiency can also lower the cost of sustained fighting, which leads to forever wars.
Yeah.
So you get a war that just doesn't end because it doesn't cost much. And there's huge psychological impact of unpredictable drone surveillance, sudden bomb strikes that really produce severe anxiety over long periods of time. So there's too many downsides for it to balance out.
The other thing is I suppose the accountability of AI. Again, if you know, with Putin bombing hospitals, for example, that would be considered under the Geneva Convention a war crime if that was deliberately targeting that, and in Israel, in Gaza, indeed as well. But it's who's to blame, right? Because if the AI is autonomous, a country, Putin then go, well, I didn't tell it to do that. It decided to do that. Therefore, our hands are clean.
Exactly right. And one of the great concerns I have about the rush to develop AI weaponry is that it's already shaking up things like the Geneva Conventions, exposing gaps in accountability you mentioned, in ethics, in international humanitarian law. The conventions were set up in 1949. They certainly didn't have autonomous weapons in mind. But taking Russia as an example, it's committed numerous war crimes in its bombing campaigns, many of them very likely to involve AI targeting and jamming defensive attack drones, rather. And there have been reports of drones dropping grenades on civilians. So as AI scales up with things like that, we're going to see even more violations of the Geneva Convention, and it'll get harder to build peace treaties because of the very issues you've touched on, accountability. And when there's no clear responsibility, there can be no accountability, which makes it harder to dispense justice for war crimes after the war.
And it makes it harder to even stop those war crimes, because you've got impunity to do what you like then with AI, because if you can't be held responsible for it, it doesn't matter.
That's true. And I think in the AI age, things like peace treaties, which are in the news a lot at the moment, need to be accompanied by much broader international treaties limiting the development of certain AI systems, similar to the sort of treaties we have now for chemical weapons. We don't have anything like that for AI weaponry. We also need some broad international agreement on the ethics that should steer research away from AI weapons wherever possible. And we need public awareness so that we put pressure on governments to prioritise human control of weapon systems wherever possible.
Because I suppose if they're hacked as well, right, your weapons could be used against you. I mean, it wouldn't be too unimaginable, would it, that we could send off a bomb and somebody else could hack it and turn it round and bring it back to us?
No, and actually that's interesting. Because that's one of the problems with what we call swarming technology, which is relatively new. It's AI driven. AI's enabled engineers to build weapons such as drones that can move in clusters in the way that birds, fish and ants do, sharing their intelligence together, working together to solve problems on the go. It's all about sort of collective intelligence gathered via information loops within the group. And the challenge with swarming AI systems is that their decisions and actions can be very opaque to us. We don't really know or predict or control what they're doing at the time. So yes, once set in motion, a weapon like that could be turned against the one that's built it.
I always feel slightly worse for having spoken to you, Mal, in the best possible way. I mean that with love, because I love talking to you. Mal, thank you very much indeed. Absolutely fascinating stuff. Mal Fletcher there, who's a futurist.